Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I thought I would talk with you guys a little bit in part 8 about one of the more nuanced topics when it comes to this conjugate style training. And this is something that comes up a lot when we deal with concurrent periodization in general. And I've had people who watch what I do with it and they say, Jason, haven't you told people in the past that mixing rep ranges, like your high and low reps or different performance elements in the same workout, can be problematic from programming perspective? And you know what? That's a fantastic topic to address, because what people need to realize is that we aren't really doing that the same here as we would do in normal concurrent periodization regarding two different performance elements. And what I mean is that your primary work here is separated. In other words, max effort days versus dynamic effort days, that is your real programming difference. And we're not using the high reps as, number one, a primary training effect, and number two, our primary performance element that we're training, we aren't training multiple times per week. And that is where the big difference occurs. So let me explain. Normally, when we talk about normal concurrent periodization, let's say you're just mixing higher intensities, which is low rep, with lower intensity, higher reps. So let's say you're doing sets of 3 and sets of 10, right? We can just throw that out there. Normally, what you find if you're going to say squat twice a week and you're going to go with limit sets and do really heavy triples or heavy singles, if you do back off work with sets of 10, you interfere with your recovery and your ability to do both again with maximum training volume. So what ends up happening, because you fatigued yourself so much after the heavy work, you're not going to be as recovered next time you try to come back around to do heavy work. So by mixing them in the same session, what you're going to find is that on session 2, let's say Monday you squat. So if you do really high rep squats after your really heavy squats on Monday versus Thursday, when Thursday rolls back around, you start reaching a point to where you haven't recovered enough to squat heavy again due to the additional loading being done, right? So what will end up happening with concurrent training, what you usually note is that over the course of several weeks or months, if you were to take a group of lifters and have them mix the rep ranges in that regard versus do them separately, you're going to find that the weekly workloads go up more for people who separate them. So let's say you're going to run a normal concurrent periodization and you work in the 1 to 3 on Monday, and then say the 8 to 10 on Thursday, and then you plot them over time and have the people do limit sets, actually do the heaviest weights they can handle for those triples and the 10s and whatever. What you'll find is that over the course of several months, the group who separates them completely will be stronger and they'll get more weekly workload in. That's what you'll actually find. Because they won't be recovering enough because they're mixing the different energy systems. And so something has to give somewhere. They're either going to lose maximum strength or they're going to lose usually the strength stamina with the higher reps, or it's usually going to be both. So if people do try to mix them together and do the same number of sets, let's say you're going to do 5 really heavy sets or 6 really heavy sets, like 6 sets of 3 over the course of a week. If you do them all in one day, you're usually going to find over the course of weeks as you program it that you're going to be stronger on those sets of 3 if you separate them and do the sets of 10 on the other days versus if you split it in half and do them in the same day. So training the different energy systems with that high frequency will interfere with that. What happens when we separate them is that's what we're doing with the dynamic work versus the max work. In other words, our max effort days, our max effort squat day, we don't do dynamic on those days, and we don't do max effort on our dynamic days. We completely separate the performance elements. The end result is that we end up with better weekly total performance in both. And we're still getting the high frequency training in so that we get the much higher rates of muscle protein synthesis due to doing similar movement patterns at a higher frequency. So you get that benefit, but we're separating the performance elements. That's what makes it concurrent periodization. So then the topic will come up, well, since you're throwing in the high rep work at the end, isn't that going to limit the amount of volume you can do with the high rep work? Yes, because you are training it multiple times a week overlapped. In other words, it will limit the amount of higher rep total volume and tonnage you can do. Yes, it actually will. But what you need to remember is that your repetition method is not your primary training stimulus, right? Our goal is to be as strong as possible, to lift the heaviest weights possible. So we're trying to maximize strength on the max effort days and trying to maximize in speed strength on the dynamic effort days. The repetition method is just there to create fatigue. And here's my point. If you're fatigued due to recovery that you're forced to use 5% less weight because of the really high frequency then of doing the higher volume stuff, is it really hurt muscle growth? No, it doesn't. That's why we're doing that with the higher frequency. We're not worried about recovering from each performance element because we're doing the high volume, high rep stuff purely to create fatigue, to create additional hypertrophy so that we get better at the other two. Therefore, the loss of performance on it isn't as relevant. But believe me, and you are losing performance. If you're training the same energy system or same rep range or performance element to its near limits at a high frequency every week, it will limit the total performance of it. It will limit the amount of workload you're doing with each set, the weight you can use for a given number of reps. It will. That's why we only do the max effort once a week. That's why we only do the dynamic effort once a week, because we need those to be maximized. But at the end of the day, we're not losing significant hypertrophy by taking our secondary training stimulus and just taking it to limits and throwing a bunch of volume in. All that matters is, are we recovering enough to continue to grow? And so we are breaking that rule for the secondary training stimulus. And it's okay, because the workload doesn't matter as much, because we end up with really high weekly workloads as a result of it. So let's say you're doing extra quad and hamstring work both of your squat and deadlift days with large amounts of volume, and maybe even some of your off days. What's the end result? You get into better shape, you develop better work capacity, right? That's what ends up happening. But we are losing performance on the higher rep work as a result of it, because you're doing so much of it at such a high frequency. You probably aren't completely recovering those energy systems involved from workout to workout. But does it really matter? Probably not. As long as the interference doesn't interfere with our max lifts, then we don't care. We're concerned with how well are we performing on the max effort stuff, how well are we performing on the dynamic effort stuff. Everything else is just there to generate fatigue. Fatigue with an adaptative stress. We want to adapt to that fatigue. We want to gain muscle from it. If we turned our 10 rep sets into a very serious endeavor, we would want to separate them, wouldn't we? In other words, let's say you wanted to run pure repetition method instead of dynamic effort for a while. Well, and if you started doing that and you started really putting a lot of focus on that, you would have to be very, very careful about the amount of volume you want to do on, say, the max effort day, because it will interfere, won't it? Of course it will. But since we're not doing that, we're not as concerned. It really just isn't a big deal. And here's what we're looking at. Is your training volume getting so high that you're not recovering and it is interfering with your other stuff? Well, if that's the case, if you're not recovering as a result of the additional training volume of doing the extra high rep work on both of the days, let's say for your squat, for example, we're just using that as an example, then you might need to actually back the volume down a bit, because you are now exceeding your maximum recoverable volume. And if you're exceeding your maximum recoverable volume in general to the point to where it's interfering with your other lifts, again, your heavier lifts, then it is a problem, isn't it? In which case you're going to have to adjust and back down. But as a general rule, what we want to be doing is that keeping our max effort work and our dynamic effort work are going to be fairly constant. We're not adjusting the volume particularly on those. Our adjustment in volume comes from the repetition method and the accessory work and the assistance exercises, or some like Louis Simmons calls them special exercises, right? That's where we adjust our training volume. We want to train those relatively close to our maximum recoverable volume. And that's what we're adjusting. But make no mistake, we are clearly separating the other days for the exact reason that you would do so with even a high rep, low rep concurrent periodization system. So it's a different concept, but we're still applying it in the same way that we would if we were just doing traditional rep ranges and methods using a concurrent style periodization. And I know it's nuanced, it's complicated, but you have to get your head around that. For those who are trying to grasp that fact, you might want to listen to this video a couple different times to understand it. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.